Hey Next Economy Now listeners. We're so excited to share with you that we've officially opened registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA, which begins on September 17th. Our team created this course for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with 300 different social enterprises, our 9-month facilitated cohort will provide you with a supportive co-learning community. Together, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy, explore key business principles from a regenerative and just perspective, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement for global change. If this sounds like it might be useful for you or a member of your community, we invite you to join us for one of our upcoming indoor sessions on June 11th, July 23rd, August 8th, or August 20th. Plus, you can save 20% when you register for the course before July 29th. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, my name is Erin Axelrod, a partner at Lift Economy, and I'm joined today by Bayo Akomolafe. With a PhD, his work is rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world. He is the father to Alethea and Kea, the grateful life partner to EJ, son and brother, a widely celebrated international speaker, post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, and We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. Bayo Akomolafe is the visionary founder of the Emergence Network and host of the online post-activist course, We Will Dance with Mountains. Bayo, it's such an honor to have you on the show. Welcome. Bayo, can you tell me a little bit about your journey to this work?
Well, I always find it difficult tracing or creating a genealogy of, events and names and identities that have led to this. But I will tease out a story, slightly intelligible, that might create this narrative for us to digest. It starts out with me growing up in a very Christocentric environment and world. Born in Nigeria, raised, bred, and buttered, as we say, on the streets of Lagos. I had this very closed ontological appraisal of my circumstances, of the world that I was growing up in. You know the drill. You probably know the drill. Good versus evil. There's only one way to truth. That kind of thing. A Cartesian, Newtonian idea of reality that was heavily punctured when my father died. At least that's when I started to limp a bit, because my father was a centralizing figure in my world. And so I started to move closer and closer to the edges of the faith that I grew up in. I wanted to eat it all up. I read and read, and I often convey this passion, my teenage life was heavily defined by books. I don't know parties. I had no friends. I was a nerd through and through. And so I spent most of my time trying to speak to my father, who, in my view, was incarcerated, you might say, on the other side of the pearly gates. He was waiting for me to be true, to be righteous, to join him. So I needed to understand this whole concept, this machine, this divinity. At the end of that journey, so to speak, I don't think journeys are that convenient. with beginnings, middles, and endings, I came to a realization that my father was not so much behind the fence, but was diffracted everywhere, so to speak. And this came with my engagements with shamanic priests of the Yoruba persuasion. I learned at their feet. And this began to disturb the world that I thought I grew up in, the Christocentric, Christological, eschatological, salvific, messianic world that is defined by an exclusive truth and an invisibilization of other cultural modes of being. And that brought me here, in a sense. The deposing of this regime of truth allowed me to dabble in social constructivism, and then to the worlds that I enjoy and cherish today, the animist, post-humanist worlds that invite us to rethink our relationship with temporality, with ecology, with place, with the sacred. So that, in a very rude nutshell, is the story.
Beautiful. You use a term I'm not familiar with, too, that I'd love for you to define for our listeners. The first one is, you said, Christocentric. Could you share a little bit more about why you call it that? And then the other term was post-humanist.
Well, by Christocentric, I mean Christ-centered, an ontology that fixes the figure of the Christ, Jesus Christ, as the sum of all being, as the summit. So I grew up in a Pentecostal space, and Jesus is all that we knew. So hence Christocentrism. But posthumanism is a refusal to centralize Christ or any other anthropocentric being, a philosophy or a metaphysics or practices that think from the human and then proceed from there, right? Like, how do we address climate change? We need to solve it. We need to come together and solve our problems. We're starting out from the human, from design, from intention. That's anthropocentrism in a way, and it has political, ecological consequences. Posthumanism is a refusal to think the human apart from ecology. It's to notice that Aaron and Aaron's identity is a hybrid concatenation or entanglement with where you are right now, instead of just something divorced from place and space.
That is such an incredible mind shift, I think, for many of our listeners too. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about how that shows up in your work today.
Well, the work that I think myself called to do is about rethinking crisis. It's about rethinking agency, accountability, responsibility. And I always tether it to the urgency and the immediacy of meeting my family. You see, my politics is very intense, and it comes from not just some theoretical, highfalutin attempt to conceive the world in, intelligible bites. It's the things that I talk about are secreted by my attempt to be a father to my daughter, hence my second book, These Vows Beyond Our Fences. Or in my book that I'm writing right now, an attempt to meet my son, who in normal clinical parlance is on the autistic spectrum. Like, how do I meet him halfway? Right? It comes from there. So it's not exactly work. It's like living, it's breathing and dying to me. But your question is about posthumanism and animism and what these beautiful concepts, limited, of course, but beautiful concepts invite us to notice. One of them is, one of the noticings, if you will, is this idea that I call post-activism, which is connected to posthumanism. Basically, that we're not all that. Humans are not all that. We're not going to solve our way out of this crisis. Why is that compelling to think about? There's another thesis that you might add to this, and it is that the way we think about the crisis is often the crisis. That we inhabit a very, very resilient myth that you might say emerged through the Enlightenment, 18th century, 19th century politics. This idea to rationalize the world, the human. And that idea, this liberal humanist idea, is that we are free, we are independent, and we are separate from the goings on around us, right? We are burdened with the gift of free will. We have intentionality. These are useful ways that we have deployed, or these are ways we've deployed to colonize and terraform our planet. It's just that it has very severe limitations, Aaron. Now we are noticing it's very difficult to think of ourselves as apart from furniture, as apart from technology, right? We can no longer think of ourselves as the primary users of the technologies that we build. We're noticing the ways we are used in return by the technologies that are supposed to be passive recipients of our agency. We're noticing that we are stuck in the middle. Biologists speak about the gut microbiota, the idea that there is a second brain in our guts, and this brain is populated by bacterial, microbial activisms of manifold kinds, right? It tells me that we do not own ourselves. We are not the owners, the operators of ourselves. Ourselves are largely murmurations of possibilities that are the agential trappings and workings of things that include trees and microbes and ecologies and archetypes and lingering notions of suffering and concepts and city-states and all of that. So once we start to think with the monster, this is what I would think of as a monstrous or chimeric formation. Once we start from there, then we come to a place of humility, that the individual is not as individuated as we think that we are. We are actually surrounded and have always been surrounded. And that leads to new things, I think.
I'm noticing my body as you're speaking, this sense of almost relaxation and also like a little bit more awareness of the vibration of my body. And it's a very exciting concept you're bringing in. And I'm curious, what else are you excited about?
Well, the first thing that came to mind is the book I'm writing right now. I'm not going to give you the plot or something, but there is a character in that movie of sorts, the story that I'm writing, that comes from the old Greek creation stories and myth. You probably have heard of Hesiod, 6th and 7th century BC, and his poem, Theogony, which is a story about the creation of the gods. And not to beat around that bush, but just to tell it a little bit, that the first gods or beings, so to speak, Gaia, Chaos, I think Tartarus and Eros. I think there were four, the four that came to being. And Gaia gave birth to Uranus, and she married Uranus, or they copulated, and they gave birth to 18 monsters. 18 monsters. 3 groups. The first was a group of 12 called the Titans, Cronus. And the second were the Cyclops, the Cyclopes, the one-eyed monsters. The third were the Hecatoncheires, which were fearful beings with 50 heads and 100 arms. The name literally means 100 armed. The story is about the Hecatoncheires, and where they actually shine is in this epic story that is called the Titanomachy, which is the War of the Titans, right? The Titans fought for supremacy by fighting the gods of Olympus. So that's Zeus and all the others, Apollo. And so the Olympians, or the Olympians won, Zeus and his kin won, and they banished the Titans. But they won because the Hecatoncheires fought for them. These monstrous beings fought for them. And I'm just thinking about the ways that these days, I'm thinking about the ways that the human is supported and perpetuated by a post-human or monstrous arrangement. The questions I ask these days are around how the same is reproduced, right? Why are we stuck, for instance? Why are we still speaking about doing stuff about climate change ever since we started to use the term since the 70s and even before that? Why are we stuck? Why do we know everything there is to know about racial injustice, and we still are stuck in it. You know, it's very humbling to revisit the human, not as this magisterial decree of independence, but as something that is quite organic and creaturely and fragile and connected to in relationships of fidelity, whether good or bad. And I don't want to think in terms of the binary of good or bad, but we're connected with structures and habits that exceed us. And that is a humbling thing to realize. So I'm thinking about the monstrous arrangements that perpetuate the image of the familiar, how we keep on running back into the plantation, and how we guard the borders of the plantation with pathology, with shaming, with legal matter, and different borders of different kinds. That's exciting for me to sit with.
Incredible. So here we are on the Next Economy. We call it the Next Economy podcast. And part of why we call it that, it's probably no news to you that these crises you're mentioning, crisis of white supremacy, of human supremacy, we see them as existential threats to humanity, if you will. And so our hypothesis is that whatever is coming, if it includes humans, it's going to inevitably be the next economy, because if we keep on our current path, it's existential threat. We're gonna all die, and life will go on, but it won't include the human species. And so, with that preamble, you, I believe, are innovating new ways of teaching and learning. So, how are you doing those new ways of teaching and learning and sharing in this next economy?
Well, this has a lot to do with this conceptual abundance, I think, is a gift of our times. There's a pedagogical stream that exceeds any one individual or any one insight, that is enlisting bodies, or I might say body minds, in producing shocking, rupturing lines of flight away from circles of convergence. We are asking new questions, troubling things are instigating new inquiries, new research. The pandemic is just one out of a billion instigations around us that is probing our specific commitments to certain ideas, certain ways of thinking. And now it's possible, because of this parliament of instigations, to ask new questions about, wait a minute, why do we work? Or is there something suspect about trying to defeat a virus, as if the virus were exterior to the workings of our economies? Isn't it the case that our economies are premised on the reproduction of the conditions that give birth to more and more viruses? Aren't we burning fossil fuels and encroaching on ecosystems, breaking through new land to build parking lots, and therefore creating the right gestative conditions that lead to the defreezing or thawing of ancient viruses? And therefore, it seems we're stuck in this cyclical phenomenon. We're just repeating things over and over again. And that is not possible without the world around us. So I often consider myself a trans-public intellectual. Not a public intellectual in terms of the old Socratic traditions of speaking truth to power. I can no longer trust that power, or that speaking truth to power, is the thing to do. I call myself a trans-public intellectual because I'm looking for a different public. I'm digging deep in the politics of descending to try out new economies. And economy is always wrapped up in biology, philosophy, theology. Economy is not a sectoral thing, a thing apart. It's an invitation for us to meet the questions that we keep asking over and over again. Maybe that answers the question. I don't know.
I got chills when you shared this notion that how can we defeat a virus that's outside of our economy? It's actually part and parcel to what we're creating. And I am curious, what is it that you are creating? right now. You're creating a book. You're also creating other initiatives and projects. And I'm curious if you could share those with our listeners.
I'm so excited about the things that I've been really, really privileged to see emerge around me. Of course, people associate me with the Emergence Network, which is an organization that my wife and I founded in 2015 that has blown up to be this, in a very real and compelling sense, a planetary collective of people performing inquiry, an underground collective of a different kind of politics, of responsivity to crisis. That is convening different notions, different thoughts, different language, different practices around the world. And that is also quite conjoined at the hip with my work in my course, We Will Dance with Mountains, the projects that I supervise, the Bakita project, lots of stories. So it's an extensive and entangled universe of technologies and invitations and ruptures and eruptions. So yes, I consider myself quite blessed to be working with the multiple teams and families and friends that work with me, not to solve the world's problems. We don't want to do that. But to glimpse the new and to stay with it a little while longer than we know how to.
Incredible. So going a little bit into the shadow places right now, you've mentioned some, but I'm curious, are there things that just keep you up at night that you really struggle or are fearful around? What are the few things in the world that are concerning to you?
I speak very freely about my relationship with my children. It's my highest aspiration to become a father that they remember and celebrate. And at the same time, all the methods that I have to achieve this is often, I notice they're not mine, is what I want to say. They're not mine to do. Instead, I feel that there's a crowd in the room that is preventing or intercepting my pure intentions at becoming father. Right? I'm speaking about intergenerational effects, cryptids, things that sneak in, behaviors that I wonder, are these mine? Where did this come from? So the shadows that I speak of are about the depths that we don't know or have names for, that creep up when I meet my son. And in spite of my theoretical robustness around disability or disability scholarship, I find myself wanting to fix him. I find this worm, this surreptitious and intercepting worm, upsetting the machine or upsetting the algorithm that I talk about. It's hypocrisy, but it's not guilt. It's not the kind of hypocrisy that is tied to guilt. It's a gentle noticing that none of us are free. And that's a deep shadow there.
So was there anything else you wanted to share around other shadows? You spoke about kind of your relationship to disability, which I think can resonate on so many levels with so many of our listeners. We're at a moment of having to rethink.
I mean, when I think about shadows, I don't think about like bad things, right? I think there's a popular association with shadows as bad things that we want to get rid of. I think of shadows as our necessary accompaniment in this saga, this adventure of embodiment. To try to get rid of shadows is to risk reproducing them in more virulent fashion. So I think of shadows as things that get in the way, right? Things that get in the way. And then the riddle becomes, what do I do with this obstacle? Do I own this obstacle? Do I try to sterilize it, get rid of it, blast it with explosives, try to get around it or something? And those are the questions that occupy my time. I think one of the gifts of meeting shadows is to let yourself be transformed by them. I mean, we cannot fully own them. And I don't think the idea is to own them, but to actually meet them and be met by them. So I'm speaking primarily about my fatherhood or my becoming fatherhood that seems to be not a matter of my hands and my agency or my accountability, but that of my mother and my father and their parents before them and the circumstances of our living and things that I have no name for, daemons that whisper in the ear. And staying with that trouble is at once a curse and a gift. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
You have touched on in this conversation this notion of a new mindset around how we grapple with climate disasters and climate crisis. I'm curious if you have a request for our listeners or a thought that folks can take with them around their own personal relationship to this crisis emerging all around us.
One of my favorite comedians is Jon Stewart. I like him. And that's all I'll say about that. He's funny. I like him. And he's intelligent. American, obviously. Jon Stewart has this show called The Problem with Jon Stewart. It's on YouTube. At least I watch it on YouTube. There was this behind the scenes episode he had just a while back. He's sitting with his crew, his team, and a question is raised about responsibility in a time of crisis, climate crisis. I mean, our times these days are defined by reports, ongoing reports generated by the IPCC, the sixth and final one being the one that came out recently, just basically saying, yes, colonization led to this, among the things that led to this, you might say, and we have about 3 years to get our act together. So they were speaking within the temperature, the tension of this realization that we're in too deep and we need to address this. One of the producers is speaking about her OCD-like, her compulsive behaviors around throwing plastic cups in their appropriate bins. A practice and a subculture that is quite fascinating to me, and I'll tell you why. But she goes ahead to say that she carries around plastic cups for hours and is unable to throw it until she gets to the right bin. And she acknowledges the silliness of that. She says there's something silly about that. But if we all did that, that would solve the problem, wouldn't it? And she leaves this question hanging. And then some dude, I can only refer to him as a dude because of the energy he comes with, responds to that and basically says, no, it doesn't change anything. And everyone is wanting more for him to say more. And he breaks it down in such a beautifully unusual way. I hardly see that on television. He speaks about the ways that Americans in particular are blind to the idea that most of the things they recycle, 90%, is actually shipped to Africa and Asia. That there isn't some green machine behind the emerald curtains that is magically turning their waste products into new consumer products, right? That myth is pretty strong. And what it does is that it fertilizes and inspires these dopaminergic pathways. Dopamine is the pleasure chemical, right? It inspires continuity, this ritualistic repetitiveness that we're the good guys, we're saving the planet. The thing is, most of those things that are chucked away and sent to a faraway wizard to turn back into goods is actually shipped to my country, shipped to my continent, becomes my playground, becomes the tents through which or under which people live, right? I often say in some interviews that I grew up knowing or seeing the recycle logo, triangular thing, before I knew what it meant, because I was swimming in goods that were shipped from the West. And so he comes up with this conclusion that it seems our attempts to solve the crisis is the crisis. And that is post-activism right there. And maybe that's what I often invite people to think about, if thought is possible here. That solutions, well, we may need more than solutions right now. We need something entirely different than a solution. I'm not saying we should dismiss solutions. I'm saying something more compelling than the patterning of a problem versus a solution is eating up or is guarding and curating the space that we often assign to human agency and human destiny. Denmark dumps waste at its beaches, not regularly. I'm saying that recently it spent $150,000 to clear seaweed and debris from a beach in a certain municipality. I'll be heading out to Denmark very soon, and this is quite interesting to note. And then the next day they dump the same thing back in the ocean. Right? I could see your eyebrows. They dump it right back into the ocean. My question, apart from laughing and giggling at that, my question is why? Why do we keep coming round and back to, why is it sticky? Why are we in this treacly, sticky place, this ontology that tells us that that's the thing to do? It's sensible to do that because there isn't any other way. So I feel that our solutions at best reinforce a paradigm of thinking and behaving with and acting that reinforces the carcerality of where we are, the imprisonment of where we are, and that we need a break. So we need a new aesthetic and politics of acting that exceeds the left and the right and contemporary politics in general and institutionalized ways of seeing the crisis.
Incredibly well said. Yeah. Thank you for that. As we bring our conversation to a close, and thank you so much. I know it's evening time, your time. Thank you for sharing this moment amidst all of your commitments to family. What can our listeners do to support you right now? What do you need to feel supported in this work?
Join us in our party. There's a party on the slave ship. There's a party in the hull of this ship. Join us there. Seek us out. We are composing communal technologies. We're composing aesthetics of responsibilities. This is not spiritual bypass, right? This is not turning away from the problems. This is an invitation to disturb the linearity of accountability and how that feeds fascistic carceralities that we struggle to notice when we believe we're the good guys acting on the world. So if you feel a sense of woundedness, a sense of confusion, a sense of maybe there's something more, maybe there's something different, then join us in our exploration, not of answers, but of new questions. Check out the Emergence Network. And yes, I think we'll meet somewhere in the middle. We'll see each other.
And for our listeners who might not quite understand the reference, join us on the slave ship. I know you've written about it in your blog, so maybe that you feel free to share more, or they can go and read it.
I'll decline the invitation to do that. I want to leave with that shocking invitation. I think if we reduce everything to intelligible remarks or explain everything away, the miracle of it will be dissipated into some cognitive, consumptive unit. And I don't want to do that. So let the phrasing haunt your dreams. Let it shake you out of the spell of your subjectivity. And I suppose we will find each other in new ways.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we close our conversation today?
If you see me somewhere, buy me ice cream.
Wow.
Because I love ice cream.
Bayo, your words have been deeply informative and powerfully visceral to me today. So thank you so much for your work in the world and all that you bring forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.